is Father David Archibald of St. Andrew's Episcopal Church in San Antonio, Texas. You are listening to a class that will discuss the essential story of Christianity. The purpose of the class is to summarize a story of the Christian faith in a way that modern people can understand it. I hope the way it's told will work for people just starting to think about Christianity. But I especially hope it works for those who started with Christianity and then left it behind because it just didn't make sense anymore. The class is called Initiate and Renew because when it's all done, students may want to be baptized or confirmed. Of course, that's only if in some serious way they feel the story is authentically true for them and they want to consciously commit to living it out. This retelling of the Christian story seems particularly important these days. Many modern people find Christianity impractical for their daily lives, while for others, the story has so many holes in it that it's just plain confusing. But why has the story become so unclear and muddled? One reason is the vast number of churches presenting different interpretations of Christianity, from Joel Osteen's prosperity gospel to John Hagee's fundamentalism to Pope Francis' revival of the Catholic Church. It is no wonder that folks can get a bit lost. Things are not much better in my own Episcopal Church. It contains such a variety of messages that the essential story is hard to find, like the trees hidden in a forest. And not many folks with lots of other priorities in their lives have the time to sort through so many different and contradictory stories. Perhaps you have visited a variety of churches along the way and gotten a little bewildered trying to sort through them. That's quite understandable. Other reasons for the confusion around the essential story is all the busy and sometimes important work that is required to run and be a part of church programs and church life. If you can cook or sing, or if you love kids, then there is an important place for you already in the kitchen, the choir, and the youth ministry. You may get drafted immediately as soon as you enter the doors. Those particular activities can be fun, and serving is absolutely a great way to create a sense of belonging. Once you're a part of the community, the work takes on a momentum of its own. With weddings to celebrate, funerals and fellowship potlucks to attend, buildings to fix, and good works to do for the betterment of the world, it's easy to simply skip over the essential story altogether because it's just fun being together. It's very common to have volunteered in a church and even attended the worship services for years without having had much opportunity to go ask questions and seek out the deeper meaning of the faith. The clergy have often unwittingly added to the confusion around the essential story. We present numerous classes, tell you to go to seminars and to retreats, many of which are filled with non-essential information about God. Not too many of our teachings try to tell a big story that can help you put your life in context or talk about experiencing God directly for yourselves. Too much about God, not enough talk about how to know God directly. In my church, a time came when we were trying to figure out what to teach our youth group. We were motivated to try and answer the question, what is the one thing we want to pass on to them before they graduate from school? Did we want them to know, as of first importance, how the Bible came to be? What is in the Old and New Testaments? How did the church get started and continue after Jesus? What is special about the Episcopal Church? What are the social injustices of our time that we need to act upon? What are those things called, quote, spiritual practices? How can we help our youth with their own immediate life issues, such as bullying, sexuality, and school study habits? With so many topics all spinning around in the church's blender of Christian education, it's no wonder people get confused. So, if you have ever felt a bit uncertain or confused about parts or all of the Christian faith, that would not be surprising, especially given some of the dynamics we've just discussed. So I hope this class, which tries to tell the essential story of Christianity, will be helpful. I would like to suggest, before we start, that we lay a strong foundation for the story. Any story, even this one, that I'll try to tell, it will topple over quickly if the foundation has major cracks in it to start with. I find at least 3 issues tend to undermine and weaken all religious narratives, including those told in churches. If we can set these 3 cornerstones in place, then the essential story will stand and have some staying power. The first cornerstone is this: the truth of the essential story must sit easily alongside the truths found in science. We live 6 days a week in the midst of the modern scientific worldview, with technology just coming out of our ears, and we cannot leave that behind when we enter the church doors on Sunday. The second cornerstone is this: that God has been revealing the divine nature to human beings all over the globe for thousands of years. This has been the genesis of all the major world religions. So our story must be capable of standing alongside other spiritual traditions, for certainly truth is not only found in the story that just happens to be the main one in our culture. The third cornerstone of the foundation is to fully acknowledge the great amount and intensity of suffering in the world. Our essential story must make some sense in the midst of a chaotic world and in the midst of the tragedies of human history. If there is a God of some sort, then why does he or she not prevent more of this suffering from happening? The absence of a strong foundation addressing these 3 major issues, I believe, is a major part of why the non-religious population in the West is the fastest growing part of our culture. It makes perfect sense, of course. How believable can the story of Christianity be if it attempts to operate from an old, pre-scientific worldview? How compelling is the story if it claims that the Christian religion is simply superior to all the rest? How coherent is the story if it shouts out, "Our God reigns," when there is so much suffering in the world? So I'd like to begin to address now these three foundational issues here at the beginning of this class and continue to follow up on them throughout. If we can get a start on these three topics, it will be easier to listen more sympathetically to the essential story as we move forward. Let's begin with Christianity, and it should be the one that has respect for science and also know the limits of the five senses. An earlier story of Christianity was conceived mainly in a world without science, and often the early scientists were persecuted by the church. But now we are all immersed in the scientific worldview, especially the disciplines of evolution and cosmology. So to speak about God, we absolutely must do so in ways that welcome the empirical knowledge gained about the physical universe. So while religion, as we will explain it, says yes to the empirical world of science, it also adds that there is a different mode of knowing the material world than simply testing its physical properties. For example, a religious person using a different set of eyes, you might call it mystical seeing. They may say that there is a special aspect to, for instance, a tree, a river, or a dog, that those things possess a presence or a sacredness that you cannot know by simply testing its physical properties. Similarly, such a person might discern that the human being is greater than their biology. Religion is bold enough to go even farther, suggesting that there are whole other dimensions of reality that are non-material. While much of religion cannot be tested in repeatable empirical experiments, a great deal of it can be repeated and experienced subjectively. Religion respects the work of the scientist who works with the physical understanding of the universe. At the same time, it asserts that there is more than one way of knowing the physical universe, and more than the physical universe that can be known. So interestingly, the Pentecostal and charismatic versions of the Christian story, those which hold some more antagonistic relations with science, many of them are thriving in many third world countries. However, in those places like Africa and South America, the population is not immersed in a scientific worldview. Here in the United States, any story purporting to be true must do so within the context of a people very skeptical of anything that is not purely based in the material world. The essential story, as we tell it, it will honor what the human mind has uncovered, but ultimately go beyond what the limits are of purely rational thinking. So next, Christianity, as we will explain it, is one expression of the perennial wisdom. This perennial tradition assumes that God has been revealing her or himself in the material world ever since the Big Bang, some 13.7, some say 13.7 billion years ago. The heavens themselves declare the glory of God. And God has not only spoken through the nature of the cosmos, and has not only communicated to the tribes of the ancient Hebrew people, and not only 2,000 years ago through Jesus, the Jewish teacher from Palestine, but in fact, the Creator has been revealing the divine nature, a perennial wisdom, to all of humankind throughout history. This has become the foundation of the world's great religions. Now, of course, this divine revelation has been filtered through the lenses of the historical context and culture and language of many different holy people. To use a common metaphor, the traditions affirm there is only one mountain, which stands for God. Religious explorers have received revelation about the mountain and responded by creating rituals and texts appropriate to their culture and their time, and especially their place at the bottom, at the base of the mountain. At the more mature stages, as saints journeyed toward God at the summit, the various religions found much more common ground. At the pinnacle, they find themselves at the same place. What looked so different down at the bottom now looks very similar at the top. Christianity has its own wonderful guidebooks, saints, art, music, doctrinal truths, all particular to the path that began somewhere around the base of the mountain. All of those items are available for those who are walking the path up the mountain from that particular side. And the Christian story speaks of a wonderful path walked fully by Jesus that leads to the top. Followers of Jesus must commit to his path, not lose heart when the path gets hard to see or gets steep. We are aware that at the lower stages of the climb, trying to follow the guidebooks and the guides, which are particular to another side of the mountain, is very confusing. It is best to pick one path and commit to it wholeheartedly. Finally, I find that one of the biggest difficulties with many versions of the Christian story is the way that God is primarily imaged and described as the kingly ruler of the universe. The reason this image of God is so difficult for many is that the king is supposed to intervene from afar to protect the good and the innocent while punishing the bad evildoer. But this becomes so hard to believe that this is reality when we read about what's actually happening in the world and read the history of humankind. For in our world and throughout its history, it seems to be just one war or one famine and one plague after another. And often the evildoer does prosper and the innocent do get hurt. So, Is there a way to read reality and tell the Christian story so that it makes better sense of our lived experience? I would like to suggest another way. What if God, for all practical purposes, is not like an all-powerful king sitting somewhere else watching humanity? Suppose rather, first, that God has limits, because most often the divine must work through human beings. And given our immature and egocentric proclivities, this makes God the most vulnerable as well as the Almighty One. What if God should better be described as the most vulnerable one? And what if God is not far away, but present with the people in their suffering? This would mean that the divine was not an aloof king watching from afar, but present and with, and yes, suffering with, the world. And what if this God really did care about human suffering, but mainly did work through human beings who would be the divine hands and the sacred feet of God in the world? This God would be addressing suffering then from the inside out, not intervening from the outside. When doctors heal a person, and when a new democracy brings greater freedom to its citizens, well, then you see God caring for people to alleviate their suffering. And what if God did not, perhaps like the king, lash out in anger against the enemies, but patiently endured great injustices, as people do here in this world? And what if this world was never meant to be a comfortable place where God simply sets down laws and the obedient ones get rewarded and the bad ones get punished? Instead, what seems to be happening in this world is more like a school, a place to learn, and suffering is part of the curriculum. The goal of the school is to learn how to become wise and mature beings, skilled at both spiritual and material reality. Suffering is the great teacher and even the transformer. The call to take up the cross, endure, and be transformed by it are teachings directly from Jesus. His own journey going through death is the lived out example of this way of life. So the image of God just described is quite different from the aloof king sitting far away on a throne, occasionally intervening from the outside. Instead, we have this image drawn from the life of Jesus, which looks something like this. He shows us a vulnerable God who usually faced rejection and never coerced others into following him, who is like a suffering servant in solidarity with the poor and the social outcasts, not far off, but sharing life with those who hurt. And he seeks out to heal brokenness, as you might see in the individual healings that he can do. And this God, as we see in Jesus, endures persecution and torture. He's called the Lamb of God. And this God, as we see in Jesus, is transformed by going through suffering, through death to a resurrection, and then returns as the forgiving victim, giving us a new pattern to follow. So, you can see the contrast between the great King on the throne or the vulnerable God here in this world. So as we tell our story of Christianity, it will be from the viewpoint of this vulnerable God who is present with us, and not the almighty King who is far away. Now, just to summarize all three of these foundation cornerstones that we have just laid, these are our assumptions. Our story will be respectful of the role of scientific knowledge without abandoning spiritual knowledge. Our story will place Christianity within the stream of a perennial wisdom. Our story will interpret the life of Jesus as the one who came to be with us in our suffering, show us how to endure it with grace, and how to use it as a means of transformation. With this starting point, we're ready to move forward to hear a version of the essential story of Christianity. The centerpiece of the essential story is this. It is the transformation of disciples to be like the Christ through a radical change of consciousness. By the example of his life and the wisdom of his teachings, we are empowered to become like him. We are to become little Christs. Put succinctly, this requires the transformation of our egoic self-awareness into a spiritual God consciousness. We have the potential, and in fact we are built for it. It is our destiny as human beings to know that we are fully human and fully divine, like the Christ. But the older stories of Christianity have lost this vision and really simply made Christianity into an escape plan to get us into the next world. But the essential story, the gospel, is a plan to create a new world here and now by creating new people in the world. As God changes the inside, then the outside that we create is transformed. The broken world we see now is only a reflection of the brokenness inside ourselves as we live out of our small selves, not our great selves, out of our ego, not out of spirit. Quoting Albert Einstein, "You cannot solve a problem from the same level of consciousness that created it." So the transformation of consciousness is not about just another list of divine laws that we should try and follow. Rather, we have been given the power to become children of God, to quote John's Gospel, chapter 1. From this new way of being and this new way of perceiving the world, we find that love will go far beyond any laws that we might dream up. Entering this new reality, one person at a time, we experience the good news that Jesus taught. We experience it, and we enter now the kingdom of God. One can tell that they are participating in this new consciousness because they will live a deeply loving, peaceful, creative, righteous, and yes, happy life. The, quote, one-at-a-time nature of this movement of transformation is the reason we show the single red flower in the midst of the field of yellow ones. The transformation of consciousness calls for a process of growth, and it is a flowering of humanity. So this has been the first of 9 classes. With the anticipation and openness that we will need, in our next lecture we will hear the whole Christian story, the centerpiece of it being the transformation of consciousness, and we'll hear it told in one long narrative. The 6 classes to follow will examine different parts of the story in more detail and show how this story is clearly reflected in the Scripture, in the Bible, in our liturgies that we do every Sunday, and even in the art and music of the church. This essential story, as you hear it for the first time, it may cause some confusion and be disorienting at first, but in the end, it could be the beginning of great hope and joy and meaning, not just for you, but for the whole world. You are embarking on a 9-week journey which, if it catches hold, it could last for a lifetime. So thank you for listening to this first class of the Initiate and Renew series, and I'll talk to you next time.